Thank you, Mr Speaker. Very pleased to speak in this third reading of the Taxation, Annual Rates, Trans-Tasman, Savings, Portability, Kiwisaver and Remedial Matters Bill. And of course, one of the key elements of this bill, perhaps the major component, relates to the way the bill opens up for New Zealanders who have saved in Australia under that country's excellent superannuation regime to be able to come back to New Zealand with their nest egg, use it to bring capital back into this country, ensure they have a secure and perhaps long and secure retirement on the basis of the Australian superannuation scheme. And I wanted to note the way that scheme has come together to provide the capacity now for New Zealanders to come back home with a very, very nice golden nest egg. And that relates to the fact that the Australian government had, over 20 years ago, decided to put in place a compulsory superannuation scheme. It is funded by a 9% employer contribution, and Brian Gaynor in the Herald recently commented about the benefits of that scheme to Australia, that over the last 10 years, the Australian superannuation assets in total have risen nearly threefold, from around 484 billion Australian dollars, 484 billion, to now 1,257 billion dollars. And what that means is those New Zealanders who are returning home and bringing their superannuation, as this Trans-Tasman Portability Bill provides for, will be able to return with an average of around Australian $56,000. $56,000 in savings is what the average Australian has been able to generate through the scheme that their government, in its wisdom, has put in place. And the good thing about it in Australia is it's transcended party politics. It's been a scheme which has been put in place by the Hawke-Keating government, accepted by the John Howard government, and of course endured to whichever government will take place in Australia over the next few days and weeks. Now that's a very important thing, because superannuation has to be durable. The tragedy in this country, of course, is that the Labor government has 3 times worked to try and provide a platform for enduring savings, and 3 times a national government has knocked that around. The first time, of course, famously with the Kirk-Rolling scheme in 1975, abolished by the Muldoon government, replaced by a pay-as-you-go pension scheme funded by the taxpayer, which Brian Gaynor in this article in the Herald comments was the worst economic decision by any New Zealand government in the past 50 years. That's the legacy of a national government. That's why many New Zealanders went to Australia. That's because they lost their capacity to save properly in a scheme encouraged, fostered and supported by a sensible government policy arrangement. And so now New Zealanders, under this bill, are able to bring their savings back securely and safely to the order of an average savings regime of $56,000. But you know what the savings regime for New Zealanders means? The average New Zealand saving is about 10%. Just 10% of what the average Australian worker. Now, yes, there is a wage gap. There is a wage gap, and we know it's growing under this government, but nonetheless, we've got a factor of 10 in the difference between the average superannuation savings of Australians or New Zealanders resident in Australia and now able, under the sensible provisions of this bill, to bring their superannuation nest egg back to New Zealand and allow them to have a secure and long retirement based on that sensible savings regime. So we've got about 10% of the savings. And one of the other things about this bill is connections to Kiwisaver. What those New Zealanders who've been resident in Australia are able to do is bring back their money and park it in Kiwisaver, an excellent scheme introduced under the last Labor government. But going back to my original comments about the need for durability, the need for superannuation to not be played party politics with, one of the great tragedies, and I think that future commentators like Brian Gaynor may note this, is that we have lost under this government, in the first flush of tax cuts, which we know most of the money went to the top third of income earners. In fact, the top 3% of earners got about a third of the money from the first round of national government tax cuts. And how did they fund those? They funded that by cutting by cutting the Kiwisaver contribution from 4% employer contribution back to 2% employer contribution. But where are we now? Where are we now? In the last few days, we've had the Prime Minister announce that we actually do need to start looking at compulsory savings option. So where were we less than 2 years ago? Cutting a Kiwisaver regime, which were giving 1 million New Zealanders the capacity to start building towards the sorts of saving regimes which this bill will allow New Zealanders to bring those Australian-sourced nest eggs back to this country. We were en route to creating our own savings regime, which would allow New Zealanders to build their own security in retirement. And what did the government opposite do? It cut that savings regime in half. It cut it in half in a venal way, simply to guarantee itself some capacity to win the last election. We know that the funding was cut. We know that 30% of it went to the top 3% of tax earners, so it was a payback time for the National Party's mates, for its wealthy mates, at the cost of working New Zealanders and their efforts to secure themselves some form of security in retirement. Some form of security in retirement, which the Kiwisaver scheme was providing, cut in half in a cynical, exploitative way by the National Party in opposition, seeking to get its seats on the Treasury benches. And here we are, less than 2 years later, scrambling around trying to forge a new consensus on superannuation and savings. But even as that starts to take effect, even before the task force has been formed, we have the Minister of Finance today on Morning Report saying, oh no, we're not going to have any net increase in government contribution to this new platform for security and superannuation and saving for New Zealanders. That's off the agenda. So we've had 1, cuts to Kiwisaver, 2, now the admission that we actually do need to start savings for ourselves, so we're not wholly dependent on New Zealanders going to Australia to lift our savings regime, and under this bill able to bring their savings back so they can retire comfortably and securely in New Zealand. We've actually now got a government which is precluding some of the sensible options which at the very least need to be considered if we're going to have any prospect whatsoever of having an enduring superannuation and saving regime for this country. So this government stands indicted on those points. And it was interesting to note the comments in the recent Trans-Tasman about why this has happened. Why has the Prime Minister indicated that we're now going to have a working party, a task force, looking at compulsory superannuation? Here's what Trans-Tasman had to say. John Key sniffs a shift in opinion since 92% of voters rejected compulsory superannuation at a referendum in 1997, and a growing public awareness of the implications of living longer. But his case for compulsory saving is not yet compelling enough for hard decisions. The government will wait until it considers recommendations from a panel of experts who will examine all the issues around retirement savings. Well, actually, yes, Trans-Tasman is right. The Prime Minister has sniffed a change in public opinion, a change in public opinion which reflects the fact that 1 million New Zealanders have voted with their feet for Kiwisaver, have opted into the scheme, have acknowledged the value of having a scheme which allows an employee contribution, yes, an employer contribution, yes, and a government contribution, yes. A three-legged stool which gives a superannuation scheme some prospect of endurance, some prospect of stability, some prospect of being able to be drawn on into the future. But when we have the Minister of Finance within days of the Prime Minister indicating that he wants to see a regime on compulsory superannuation given some look-over by a task force, when we have the Minister of Finance effectively undermining that and saying, well, you can have that review all right, but don't think that there's going to be any prospect of government contribution to superannuation and savings. Don't even think about that. Why would that be? Why would he want to pull one of the three legs away from the only way you can build an enduring, sustainable superannuation scheme that can give New Zealanders the sort of savings in retirement which this bill provides for those New Zealanders who've opted to spend a portion of their working lives in Australia, have built up nest eggs 10 times 10 times what this nation is able to generate by way of savings, because we've got a government with a track record on history dating back more than 30 years, which is it'll play politics